The workers at Frito-lay are on a strike in Topeka, Kansas, and they had been on strike for more than 2 weeks asking for better working conditions and pay. The way that they tell it, they've got good reason to take action. Some of the plant's 850 employees have been subjected or even forced to work in overtime and work in 84-hour weeks with no days off. And one worker wrote a public letter to the company describing a harrowing scene where a co-worker collapsed on the job and died. The people in charge, she wrote, had us move the body and put it in another co-worker to keep the line going. The Frito-lay says that it's committed to providing a safe and fair workplace, and it has offered a 2-year contract it believes addresses the workers' concerns, including capping required work hours at 60 hours a week. Thus far, the sides have not reached an agreement. The strike has garnered quite a bit of attention in the media and online, and it tends to happen with collective worker actions. Like, look at Amazon workers' recent failed push to unionize in Alabama, or the squatterel candidates showing up on Stop and Shop pick lines. But as it also tends to happen, there's discussion among members of the public of how to support the workers, and the best way to do that isn't always fucking clear. But social media posts help raise public awareness, but they don't accomplish much tangibly. The effectiveness of boycotts can vary, and focusing on a single company's bad actions, it can muddle the bigger systemic picture. Mark McCarter, a pelletizer and steward at Frito-lay in Topeka, had told Vice that he and his co-workers would rather that nobody buy any Frito-lay products as long as the strike lasts, including Fritos, Doritos, Tostitos, Funyuns, and Cheetos. He said they would prefer people avoid the products from the parent company PepsiCo too. That's a bit of a break from Amazon workers earlier this year, who specifically said that they were not calling for a boycott. In light of all this, people had reached out to Kate Bain, who's Bon, the director of labor markets policy and the interim chief economist at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, to discuss what's going on here. We talked about the evolving public conversation around workers' rights and what it means for people to be paying attention, and how individuals can best direct their energies if they want to make work fairer and safer. And hint, the best way to help Frito-lay workers may not be to stop buying Doritos for 2 weeks, but instead to support the pro-labor politicians and policies. The conversation lately edited for strength and clarity is below. Basically, the conversation was between two people, Emily and Kate. Basically, Emily said to Kate, "It's my sense that there's been more attention to worker rights among the general public lately. Is that right, and is it good?" Kate responds by saying that people are paying more attention, and what I sort of see as an inflection point is the hashtag Red for Ed movement, a series of teacher strikes and protests that began back in 2018, which exemplified a new wave of labor movement and a new wave of awareness. And there's research from that period of time that shows that people became more aware because it affected their daily lives. But one study looks at parents with children in schools versus parents or children who are slightly younger who are being homeschooled. It found that parents who were faced with more labor activism became not only more sympathetic to those labor activists in the hashtag Red for Ed movement, but it also expressed more interest in collective action in their own workplaces. Also, the next question was, around Frito-lay specifically, there have been questions about whether to boycott its products or PepsiCo's company. The parent company, basically. And finally, one of the company's workers came out and said people shouldn't buy those companies' products while they're striking, but should consumers wait for workers on directives like this? Basically, Kate said absolutely, you always follow the workers' leads. Broadly speaking, boycotts are primarily for raising public awareness versus causing major economic harm to some of these companies. It's more about fostering solidarity, and that's my perception of where boycotts come from. It's like a public image campaign, and it puts a lot more pressure on the company, and if there is broad awareness that they are not doing right by their workers. This makes sense, and something similar did happen with Amazon workers trying to unionize in Alabama this year. But the ask was sort of the opposite, right? Workers didn't ask for a boycott, and some people called for it anyway. Kate again said that that's where I say you follow the lead of workers, because I trust the fact that workers are working with union organizers and strategists and people who have a handle on the best way to raise public awareness. In some cases and some products, it may be useful to have a boycott, But in some cases, like Amazon, I defer to the fact that workers are experts at their jobs, and they are working with people who are experts on union campaigns, and they know more than the regular consumer. Emily asked basically, but is the public getting smarter about worker rights overall? Basically, Kate said it has continued to evolve, particularly it's early in the pandemic, but there was some action on workplace safety that brought to the four long-standing workplace safety issues. It reached a boiling point, and maybe a point where people were able to do more, to be more perceptive, because we were all dealing with the public health crisis, and there were concerns about the health of people who worked in grocery stores, and people were also afraid to go to grocery stores and understand the threat in the same ways. We've had 40 years of rising income inequality, and it has just reached a threshold where people are beginning to recognize that a lot of what has caused these broad trends in income inequality and economic inequality, broadly speaking, is a lot of power disparity in the economy. We can't have an efficient allocation of our resources in a really disparate power structure. Some of the ways to address these huge long-term economic trends is by rebalancing power, and that is done through things like the labor movement. Emily basically asked, should we be surprised at some of the of the conditions that workers are still facing, and some of the problems that the Frito-lay workers are describing are quite disturbing. Basically, Kate says, I don't think so, again, because of these broad trends. The wide-scale attacks in the labor movement that began in the late 1970s and early 1980s chipped away at the social infrastructure that was needed to protect workers. Effective occupational safety and health administration, also known as OSHA, the enforcement has been diminished, and there isn't a high enough density of unions to ensure that workplaces are safe. And these are what they call long-term trends. One could certainly argue that it got worse in the last 4 years because some of the tools that we had to address some of these big effects of the economic inequality and how it affects the workers and workplaces were chipped away. But there was obviously a lot of great staffing at the executive level, and a lot of unintentional diminishing of the federal workforce, and we really need those types of institutions. The economy does not take care of these sorts of problems. The economic evidence points to the fact that the economy will not just self-regulate to ensure that workplaces are safe, but we need institutions, meaning the government and the labor movement, to rebalance the power. Emily said for a lot of consumers it feels good to be able to do something to at least feel like they can support workers' movements, whether it means tweeting out hashtag or boycotting or whatever. But is that really helpful? Like, does me deciding not to buy Doritos for a week make a difference? Kate basically said it's good for people to have awareness. Boycotts and social media are tools that do help to raise public awareness, but what needs to happen is policy reform, both changing labor laws and improving the functioning of the Department of Labor after 4 years of being gutted, and that is what we actually need to turn to turn the tide against these exploitative forces. In order to make those policy changes, we do need more public support. Basically, so that people are voting for more pro-labor politicians, and they're putting pressure on politicians to pass legislation that helps workers. And that is what we ultimately needed. It's not going to be one of the boycotts based on whatever worker collective action got more attention in the media, but a step in doing that is raising public awareness. Emily says, can you dig in a little more on what some larger scale fixes would be here? I think it's easy to think you did a tweet about the Frito-lay workers or whatever and feel like you helped. Kate says that we feel good when we do these individual actions, but it gives you an excuse to think that it is all just about Frito-lay. It's not. It's broad trends in economic inequality and outsized corporate power. Basically, what we need are things like broad structural change. A first step is the Protect the Right to Organize Act, also known as the PRO Act, which is a bill that has been reintroduced on the Hill multiple times, and that it would make it easier for workers to unionize. That's a first step toward diminishing some of the barriers that we've seen toward unionization across the board. Employers are very comfortable with breaking the law and violating workers' labor rights because there's very little recourse. So why wouldn't they do illegal things to prevent unionization if they can get away with it, or if the fines are very minimal? It is good to unionize in the old model, but there's been a restructuring in the economy that means that we need to think expansively toward the future. We have very large companies that have power across the nation, and we have a fissured workplace, meaning that, for example, maybe the people who claim that the Frito-lay factory are not actually employed by Frito-lay, but they are employed by a third party. And so if you have joint employer standards, it would mean that if you're the person cleaning and work for a contractor, but a Frito-lay, then Frito-lay does have some responsibility for workplace safety, even though they're not your direct employer. The next step from that would be something like sectoral bargaining. There are proposals that would make it easier to organize and bargain across sectors, even in the absence of actual collective bargaining agreements. There could be things like worker councils that would help establish workforce safety and job quality standards. We need those first steps of passing the PRO Act and raising the minimum wage. The broad suite of policies that have been reintroduced year after year have not gained much ground, and then we need to think about how the economy has changed over the past 50 years and how we need to reform our institutions and our laws to reflect the current structure of the safety and the economy, basically. Basically, Emily's last question was, if the answers are really policies and enforcement, then what should a normal consumer do, and how do we help? Kate said that old adage that there is no ethical consumption under capitalism is true. We aren't going to make broadside scale change through individual consumption choices. The economic hit that Frito-lay may experience for the next couple of weeks is not going to make them change their whole business model. If their business model is based on exploitation, that is their bottom line. Diminishing their profit margin for a couple of weeks is not going to make them fundamentally restructure. People can engage in movement building, like the racial justice movement last summer, and going to protests and joining picket lines. They can advocate with policymakers by voting for the policymakers who pass pro-labor reform and holding them accountable, putting pressure on them. And we need both. History has shown us that we need movement building alongside policy reform, and you can't have one or the other. So if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, right? RVW King, and then also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out. And thanks for listening.